Welcome back into the Dynasty Nerds YouTube page. I am Garrett Price, and I'm super excited about the episode that we have going on today. We have Matt Harmon, Mr. Reception Perception himself, in the house today. Matt, how you doing?
Garrett, thanks so much for having me back on, man. A great show last year. The 2021 class was really fun, really exciting. This was another crop of guys. It was, really interesting to study. And I almost like doing the post-draft shows just a little bit better than the pre-draft shows, just because like now we don't have to talk in hypotheticals. We don't have to say like, oh, I
Sure.
hope this guy gets in a good landing spot, or there's, this, that, or the other. Like now we really know what it's going to look like. So I'm excited to talk with you today.
Absolutely. This time of year is so much fun, and yet you're absolutely right. Now we can kind of plan things out a little bit easier, a little bit better. And speaking of now knowing the landing spots, I'm curious for you. Is your dynasty wide receiver one in this rookie class the same as your redraft wide receiver rookie in this class?
Yeah, I think Drake London is going to be my wide receiver for sure. My wide receiver one in Dynasty, and most likely going to be my wide receiver one in redraft as well. Really high on the player. Think he's just a great all over the, checks a lot of boxes, right? I mean, I think he's a really good
Yeah.
underneath separator. I think he's really good in contested situations, really, shines after the catch too. Just a very versatile player that I think Arthur Smith is going to have a lot of fun with. But I wouldn't be surprised though if Chris Olave like ends up leading the rookie wide receivers in yards, just because I like the landing spot and I was really high on the player.
Right.
So I do think he's like an outside shot to lead this group in yards. But I think from a pure fantasy angle, I think Drake London is wide receiver one in redraft and in Dynasty as well.
I like the Olave call. I am interested to see what the ghost of Michael Thomas does this year. And then, Jameis
Me
Winston,
too.
he's been great for fantasy guys in the past. So, absolutely. All right. So what's one guy in this class that you think is maybe a little bit overrated? You've heard a lot of hype on the player, but you're like, I just don't see it as much as everyone else does.
I don't know that I would say anyone in this class is super overrated. I think everybody kind of went in the right draft range. Even guys like, I mean, Christian Watson, I think might be the first, example of a player that like, I thought when he was a first round potential, guy that might have been getting over our skis a little bit with him, but I don't mind where the Packers made that bet. I do think obviously there's a lot of questions in the profile. I think he's raw as a route runner. This year for receptionperception.com, I did the same thing I did last year, put 12 full prospect profiles out there, guys in the sortable table, all that type of stuff. But in addition to that, I put out something called the Rookie Roundup, where I took some mini samples on guys that, didn't get a ton of film on, but still wanted to get an evaluation up on them. He made that group. He's just a tough eval, obviously, because man, they don't run a ton of pass routes in that offense there that he was in
Right.
college. He's not a guy that's going to see it. You don't see a ton of reps against press coverage. There's a lot of projection there, but the Packers are a traits-based team. Height, weight, speed, size thresholds, all that stuff. I totally get where he checked the box there. In the rookie roundup for reception perception, I actually compared him to Martavis Bryant. I know that, like, I'm sure Packers fans, when like
Yeah.
you see a Marquez Valdez Scantling as the player comp on draft night, you're kind of like, yeah. I mean, we just didn't re-sign the guy, right? So like, is that really the best comparable player? I think Martavis Bryant leans more on like the optimistic side of his range of outcomes, but certainly does give you a range, right? Bryant, even when he was on the field, had his ups and downs as a player, but really freaky stuff after the catch, especially. I think that's where Christian Watson can really shine, is like get him routes in the middle of the field, get him out in space where he can break some tackles and use his speed in that way while he develops as an outside receiver. So I think Watson, he just has a really wide range of outcomes. And, there are guys who went after him in the NFL draft that I would probably take ahead of him in rookie drafts, even with the landing spot. Guys like Skye Moore, who I was a big fan of. Him and George Pickens.
Yeah.
It's kind of tough to like between Christian Watson and George Pickens for dynasty rankings. It's like those two guys are really close. Even a player like David Bell, man, David Bell went in the third round. I was a big fan of him as a player, just from like the potentially projecting him as a big slot type of player there with the Cleveland Browns. And that's a wide open depth chart as well.
Yeah, Matt, I love what you said about Christian Watson. I definitely understand that he is, more of a raw prospect, but has some of those skills and some of those traits that teams just envy. And so, I think he's the most
Mm-hmm.
boom bust guy in the class. Could he end up being, one of the top 3 receivers in this class just based on his traits alone? I wouldn't be surprised at all. Could he flame out after 4
Right.
years? That's in the range of outcomes as well. So it's gonna be pretty fascinating to see how all of this comes together. Now, conversely, let's look at a guy that maybe you're higher on than most, where you're like, man, I don't know why more people are interested in this player, or maybe even why the NFL wasn't more interested in this player. I loved his stuff on perception, reception, or reception, perception. I don't know what other people are missing. What's that player for you?
Yeah, I think there's some names there. Jahan Dotson was a guy I really liked, and yeah, I thought he might have been able to qualify for this. And Washington takes him in the first round, which was
Yeah.
pretty crazy. Obviously, from a big board perspective, that was aggressive, but I still really like the player. Kind of going further down the draft board, I mentioned Skye Moore. I'm a big fan of him. He ripped it up in his reception perception sample. He was obviously, again, lower competition. You have to adjust for this type of stuff. I always say with reception perception, especially with the college players, level of competition in the NFL level is pretty flat. Like, I'm okay comparing guys across the NFL level with their results, just because, again, the level of competition is pretty flat. All of these guys are really good players. There's weaker corners out there. There's weaker defenses, of course, stuff like that. But it's much more drastic at the college level, of course. So, when I say that Skye Moore was number 1 in success rate versus zone coverage, number 2 in success rate versus man and press, among the guys that were charted this year, obviously, of course, he's not like Jameson Williams playing in the SEC, or even Chris Olave, Garret Wilson, these guys playing at Ohio State. So some context needed there, but I think what that goes to show us is, I'm not saying he's better than those other players, but at his level of competition, he was dominant. He was electric. He was able to, get separation all across the route tree at every single position. I can't wait to see kind of where he files in for the Kansas City Chiefs. Obviously, the landing spot is awesome, but they have Juju Smith-Schuster there, who's a great big slot receiver. I think Juju's kind of almost in, maybe not as much in dynasty circles, but certainly in like NFL circles, has swung from like being the most overrated receiver in the NFL to being one of the more underrated guys. But
Yeah.
he's, again, more of a slot only player. Then you've got MVS as like a pure vertical outside receiver. Skye Moore, I think, is a guy who could line up everywhere. Skye Moore is a guy I think he has the release moves to get off press coverage on the outside, everything like that. So I can't wait to see where he lines up. And then another guy further on day 3, Khalil Shakir, to me, great landing spot
Yes.
with the Bills. Really liked his ability to, I love Khalil Shakir. I think I wouldn't have been surprised. I would have been totally fine if somebody took him in round 3. If the Bears or someone like that made him a 3rd round pick or whatever, I would have been totally cool with that. For him to go, later on in the draft to the Buffalo Bills, great landing spot. I think Shakir knows how to get open against zone coverage, shows some traits to beat man coverage as well, but he might also just file right into that slot receiver role for the Buffalo Bills. Obviously, they lose Cole Beasley. They bring in Jamison Crowder, who's an aging player, who's had some trouble with injuries. Shakir could be a guy who pops early on, or at least earlier than expected. And Garrett, I would say that like everybody wants to find Deebo Samuel. That's silly. Like, we don't need to compare everybody to Deebo Samuel. But the thing that made Deebo so special, basically from his college days but especially last year, is he has unbelievable contact balance. Shakir also has that great contact balance in the open field, and that's a dimension that the slot receiver previously in Buffalo, Cole Beasley, that's not really his game. I think that Shakir could actually, if he ends up finding the field, could provide a different dimension to an already great offense in Buffalo.
Man, I loved everything you just said. I'm a really big Shakir fan. I think that he was fantastic. I think he's going to be a great slot receiver, but did so many things well. You can tell that he has a high football IQ. And talking about Skye Moore, as far as my tape grades went, he actually had the best release off the line out of anybody, which was super shocking
100%.
because he wasn't, a receiver early on in his college career. So for him to develop
Yeah.
that quickly was just really, really, really impressive. So I'm glad you brought up those 2 players, because those are 2 guys that I'm fully on board with as well. I think they could both be really effective players at the next level. So when you were going through reception perception, and you were charting these different guys, and looking at these different guys, you mentioned George Pickens. I'm curious, how was your evaluation for him? Because obviously there was less tape on him, and he was coming back from injury with the last few games of this past season. How did that evaluation process go for you?
Yeah, he's one of the tougher evals just from that standpoint. Obviously, his best season. This was an issue that I had with the guys coming off like the COVID interrupted season for last year. And then sort of, he was really the only guy that I had to ask this question about previously. It's like, do you go back and, look at for like Rondale Moore from last year's class? Do you go back and chart like their
Yes.
best season, which for Rondale Moore was like 100 years ago? Or do you go back and look at like their most recent season? For Pickens, I decided to do not his most recent season, sort of compromised and went to 2020. Not his freshman season, which was obviously, I think, his best collegiate season, but, coming back from injury, he was barely playing, like not even playing a full sample of snaps, in this 2021, games that he had there, which is a credit to him too, by the way, to come back from an injury in spring to work back for a competing playoff team, obviously there at Georgia, and try to bring that dimension. So I went to his 2020 season, and, it's funny. Sometimes when you're charting George Pickens, you're watching George Pickens, it's like, man, I feel like I'm watching T. Higgins. Other times it feels like you're watching Dante Moncrief with just some of like the mistakes in there. So I think that, again, talk about a range of outcomes there. That's a pretty wide range of outcomes. Now, I think with George Pickens, what made him an appealing player in this class is that he is a pure X receiver, like a T. Higgins type. I said early on in the process, like NFL evaluators who love that classic throwback X receiver, they're gonna love George Pickens because he lines up outside on the line of scrimmage, does not get moved around pre-snap like some of these other guys did and will at the NFL level. He just is out there asked to beat press coverage a ton, saw more press coverage than any of the guys I charted. But he was pretty good against it. Number 3 in success rate versus press coverage. I think he's got some decent release moves off the line of scrimmage. Obviously has some freaky ability to win the ball in the air. There's a lot of high ceiling potential there. I can see why the Steelers, who kind of sneaky have like a volatile wide receiver room, Deontay Johnson, who I'm a big fan of,
Yes.
on the last year of his deal, Chase Claypool coming off a down season that I think he has to wear some of the disappointment from last year. It's not just Ben Roethlisberger. Obviously, but the funny part is like, the Steelers lost their 2 biggest losses in free agency were Juju and Ray McLeod. Obviously, lose James Washington as well, but those guys were their slot receivers last year. Deontay, like 7% of his snaps in the slot last year. Chase Claypool, fewer than 20%. Like George Pickens, like I said, is a pure X receiver. So, they draft Calvin Austin later on, who, maybe profiles as more of a speed slot guy because of his size. I like Calvin Austin too, by the way. I know the size is just crazy low, but, definitely has some speed there. So I think with George Pickens, ended up, looking at that 2020 season, I do think he has starting potential as an X receiver. I'm interested if he earns a year 1 role. Is it going to still be in that X receiver spot? And then what does that do to guys like Claypool, who, remember this? I know you know this, Garrett, and I know other people remember this too. This is a guy that people talk about as like a potential tight end in the NFL. Does he get moved to that big slot position, which maybe that works out for him better than, being an outside guy against press coverage all the time? I don't know, but I think that's a fascinating situation to watch.
All right, last guy I want to ask you about, and I was watching the telecast, and Daniel Jeremiah comes on, and this guy goes in round 2, and he's like, I'm surprised. I didn't even think he was going to go at all today. That's Wandel Robinson, wide receiver for the New York Giants now, former Nebraska player that kind of did this hybrid wide receiver running back role, then transfers to Kentucky, has an incredibly successful season in the SEC. But we're talking about another guy that, as far as his size goes, is much smaller. How do you view him? Was that a reach by the Giants, or is this going to be, the next Tyree Kill or the next Debo, like all these guys that we keep trying to classify as these players? How do you feel about Wandale Robinson?
I was as stunned as Daniel Jeremiah that he went, what was he, like the 8th receiver off the board or something like that? It was very surprising that Wandale Robinson went that high. I talked about Calvin Austin just a little bit ago, and how he was a guy that, he's smaller player, 5'8", 170. And you go in always with those guys thinking like they're going to be these hybrid role, like you said. Gadget, I know, is like almost like a pejorative term, but you think they're going to be these hybrid type of players, these created touch type of guys. Calvin Austin out there went in as like an X receiver. I mean, and he's not going to play that role in the NFL because he's probably too small. But, like out there against press coverage, winning contested catches on the outside. Wandel Robinson, a bit more like in the as expected variety. 66% of his snaps that I sampled for the rookie roundup were in the slot or in the backfield. 18% of his routes were screens, 7% of his route were those just quick flat routes. Like that's, again, much more from that size perspective that you expect, that you think of that. But I will say the good things for Wandel Robinson here to trend positively. And I mean, like I said, I think it was an aggressive pick. It probably was not one I would have made, especially with some of the other guys on the board. But did show some ability to get open on dig routes, on corner routes. Some flashes on the comeback routes as well. So there might be some more deep potential there. And what was really impressive with him was actually had a 70% contested catch rate in the games that I sampled. He was someone who could win the ball in tight coverage. Like there are some receiver traits to work with here. You mentioned Tyree Kill. That's actually one of my favorite evaluations in reception perception because he was a very polarizing player after his first season because he was like labeled as like a gadget guy because that's how they used him in year one. But you saw as a rookie that he knew how to run NFL routes, that he knew how to beat press coverage and win contested passes. That will be key for Wandel Robinson watching in his rookie year. Does the route running develop? Does he show more than just gadget traits? But the thing that as soon as they made this pick, the one thing that it just signaled to me was, okay, I don't care what they say in the post-draft press conferences. There's clearly some, contention with the Kadarius Toney thing there, and they're kind of hedging their bets a little bit. It's a different staff than the one that drafted him last year. I mean, obviously Toney was not a favorite reception perception prospect coming into the league. I think there's a lot of development that needed to go on there. I don't think we saw it enough in year one, despite some of the flashes. And obviously I think there's some, just not on the playing field type of concerns there as well. So we'll see what happens with Kadarius Toney. But yeah, Wandel Robinson, certainly a guy that was an aggressive pick. But we'll see if he ends up developing into that kind of slot receiver role that's been pretty crucial for Brian Daboll's offense, at least in like maybe he's like his version of Isaiah McKenzie, and they just went to great lengths to make sure they secured that player.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, that would be a fascinating development if that was the case. But Matt, I really appreciate you taking the time out here today. Tell the good people that are watching this video how they can find you. What are you working on right now? What's the one thing they need to plug into? Anything that you want to talk about?
Hey, I appreciate you having me as always, Garrett. It's always good to chop it up with you. It's like I said, this having the landing spots is so much more fun now to discuss these prospects. If people want to check out more, go to receptionperception.com. I've got full profiles, like I said, on plenty more guys that we didn't touch on today. There's plenty of guys in the rookie roundup as well. The 2021 rookies, the Rashad Batemans, the Elijah Moores, obviously Jamar Chase, and plenty of names. Those guys are going to be added to the site. Their first year full rookie samples will be added to the site on Monday, May 9th. And my Dynasty rankings are fully updated there as well to account for rookies too. So go check it out. I think we've got a lot of good stuff coming up.
Matt, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And thank you guys so much for watching. We will be back with tons of content soon. We got a team audit coming up soon. All of the different interviews and videos that we have going on. So make sure to click and subscribe. Thank you guys so much.